Inflation Reduction Act into law. It's the largest investment in climate action in U.S. history. And according to independent analysis, it could slash U.S. emissions by 40% by 2030. It includes $370 billion of green spending, bringing the U.S. closer to reaching its goals of deep emissions cuts from the power and transport sectors. The Inflation Reduction Act would avoid 24 tons of emissions for every new ton it creates. So in this episode, we'll explore where the bill does well and where it doesn't go far enough, and what else can be done ahead of November's midterms. And we'll look at what all of this means for investing in clean technology. But first, let's dig into the details of the bill and the White House's climate agenda. What's actually in the Inflation Reduction Act? U.S. President Joe Biden describes his landmark climate, tax, and health bill as the biggest step forward on our climate ever. So yeah, it's called the Inflation Reduction Act, but its impact on our climate is arguably bigger than its potential impact on inflation. The bill contains $374 billion in climate provisions. That includes $60 billion in tax credits for clean energy manufacturing and $30 billion in tax credits for wind and solar power. It also includes incentives for Americans to buy new and second-hand electric cars, and also for those who use heat pumps to warm their homes. Republicans criticized the bill, saying it could mean higher taxes and higher energy bills for consumers. To get it over the line, Democrats had to drop ambitions for paid family leave as well. But still, this is a major legislative victory for the president, especially ahead of the November midterm elections. So President Biden has taken a big step to address the climate crisis in the U.S., but let's dig more into the details. Joining us now is Jennifer Delowy, our energy and environmental policy reporter in Washington, D.C. So Jennifer, let's just start very high level. What are the key provisions in this legislation?
Well, I mean, this law is just absolutely massive. It contains some, $369 billion that has been earmarked for energy and environmental initiatives. And, you just can't overstate really the breadth of its support for clean and advanced energy. Some of the highlights include, a $27 billion program to basically launch a national green bank and fund regional green banks. The idea there is that this $27 billion is essentially seed money. This bank will lure even more private sector capital and really act as kind of an incubator for clean energy projects across the U.S., including those that are really hard to commercialize. The legislation also, expands and reforms and creates new 10-year tax incentives for all sorts of clean energy ventures. I mean, we're talking about hydrogen as well as solar and wind power, carbon capture systems, and nuclear plants. So there's a tremendous amount of tax incentives in here to support clean energy. There's also spending for the Department of Energy's Loan Programs Office, which has been really critical in advancing new technologies. And I can tell you that the folks at the Energy Department are itching to go with that. Really, there's just so much spending and so many impactful provisions layered across this bill. One sleeper item is language in the bill and law, language in the law, really, that will bolster the EPA's ability to strongly regulate greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a combination of spending and new programs and tax credits, as well as actual language that will help regulate the greenhouse gas emissions driving climate change.
So can you just characterize how big a victory this is for President Biden, who came into office wanting to be a climate president?
Yeah, I almost think there's no superlatives that capture the breadth and scope and scale of this law. This, for the first time, really gives President Biden and the U.S. a fighting chance to actually meet the country's Paris Agreement pledge to slash U.S. greenhouse gases at least 50% by 2030, relative, of course, to a 2005 baseline. Before this moment, the U.S. was really on track to pare emissions only about 26%. And with this law, analysts say the U.S. could actually hit 40%. Now, that, of course, leaves a pretty big gulf to fill, and there will be a lot of action necessary even to get to that 40% target. But clearly, the U.S. is now within spitting distance, really, of an emissions target that seemed impossible to meet to some just a few short weeks ago.
And how also does it tie into the infrastructure spending initiatives that already had been passed earlier this year?
Yeah, great question. A lot of this is layered on top of that spending. For instance, in the infrastructure law, you had support for EV charging and EVs and transportation. Here, you have additional credits for electric vehicles. That come with some strings attached, but still are going to enable more purchases over the long term. Again, there's just these two laws are really complementary. The infrastructure law really laid a base of funding for some of these endeavors, and yet left the door open for others. So the law that just passed includes tax credits for hydrogen projects that really were left out of that first infrastructure law. One of the reasons, frankly, that Senator Joe Manchin wanted to push this thing ahead.
Well, on that point, Jennifer, for a long time, we didn't even know if another bill was going to happen. The fate of this climate bill looked very uncertain. And then kind of out of the woodwork comes Senator Joe Manchin, having slammed the brakes on the legislation before. But we now understand that that is when billionaire and clean energy investor Bill Gates decided to get involved. He jumped on a phone call with Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer to discuss the bill and had been quietly campaigning for years, lobbying Manchin and other senators on the climate issue. So that gave him reason to believe that the senator from West Virginia would come through in the end. We spoke with him. Take a listen to what he had to say about it.
We were able to talk even at a time when he felt people weren't listening, and I wouldn't have wanted to be in his position. The last 6 months have been challenging. I will say that it's one of the happier moments of my climate work.
So you can hear more of that interview on Bloomberg Green's new podcast, Zero, launching this month. Jennifer was actually one of the authors of that story as well and is still with us. So Jennifer, kind of this unlikely pairing, but Bill Gates clearly maybe made some of this happen.
There's no question that his voice was important, and frankly, there's no question that Senator Manchin was hearing from a lot of influential people, and that includes billionaires and visionary thinkers, if you will, like Bill Gates. But it also includes coal miners in his home state of West Virginia, solar executives in West Virginia and elsewhere that were really in his ear for the last 18 months, convincing Senator Manchin that not only was it critical to address to move this forward for the climate, but it was also critical for energy innovation across the country, for American energy security, and for his home state's economic revitalization coming out of coal mining and its rich history with coal.
And finally, Jennifer, obviously a lot of this is domestic focused, but I'm wondering how it translates in an international lens and what kind of credibility it gives the U.S. as it approaches the international climate change challenge.
Well, what's really interesting there is for so long the U.S. has been kind of an untrusted ally at international climate talks, and to be honest, that predated even the Trump administration's pullout from the Paris Agreement. There have been concerns about the U.S. commitment to these issues for years, and President Biden has tried, with the help of his climate envoy, John Kerry, to restore credibility. This will help. It will go a great deal to showing that the U.S. actually has a shot of fulfilling its, Paris Agreement pledge for 50% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. It also, shows that when Biden makes a promise, the Congress can be mustered to support those efforts. However, there are still challenges. It's not completely smooth sailing here. It does nothing to resolve a far thornier issue that stoked tension at UN climate summits, and that's really the inability of the U.S. and some other rich countries to make good on their promises to deliver billions of dollars in climate finance to help vulnerable countries and small, poorer nations deal with the effects of climate change and really mitigate the phenomenon. So, that's a challenge. Biden has promised at least some $11 billion each year by 2024. And the question really will be whether he can deliver it, especially if Republicans take control of either the House or the Senate in November.
Thanks to Jennifer Delowy, our energy and environmental policy reporter in Washington, D.C.